Our next guest is the author and philosopher A.C. Grayling, who's written in depth on the subject in Democracy and Its Crisis, in which he takes a whistle-stop tour of political philosophy and of democratic systems, from Plato to the English Civil War, the French and American revolutions, through to the present day. Put simply, democracy has seldom in its history looked like it does now. Might it look different in the future? A.C. Grayling's other book I'm going to reference today is The Age of Genius, the 17th Century and the Birth of the Modern Mind. It might be relevant to our conversation too, in more ways than one. Welcome, really good to talk to you.
Hello, Catherine. Very nice to hear your voice.
This is not just about the Trump era and the controversies in the United States. There's a sense at the moment that there is a real crisis for democracy as we know it right now. Do you perceive it that way?
I do. I think the Trump and the Brexit phenomena have stripped the cover off something that we've all felt a little bit uneasy about in recent years. You know, we've all felt that our politicians a little bit suspicious. The democratic order seems to be too much in the hands of people with money or people with an agenda which is very much their own and not the national interest, that kind of feeling. But I think what we've seen just recently, and social media and its use in campaigning has played a big important part in this, has shown us that actually we really need to have a look at our political and government orders in the Anglophone world, and we need to try to get them back on track a little bit. And I think that we can do with relatively modest reforms.
France is interesting as well, isn't it, when you have a president who sets up his own party just from scratch, next minute as the president, and has significant numbers in their equivalent parliamentary institution. And that seemed to be another extraordinary event of the last year or two.
Yes, it's, I think, indicative of the fact that there are lots of shifts at all levels in society in attitudes towards politics and government. What happened in France, I think, was a reaction there to the populism that we've seen pretty well everywhere across Europe and in North America. And the outcome in France, I think, has been a relatively happy one for them. I think it would have been very different if the other side of the argument had won the presidential election.
It's interesting you talk about social media. In some ways it's having the same impact as the arrival of mass literacy might have had. Frightened the church as much as anything, didn't it? And is this another thing? We think of democracy being the voice of the people, but actually very often it's not heard until it is. And that's where you get some kind of a sense of revolution.
Yes, there are things happening here which are paralleled in the social media case with the development of democracy. Now, if you look back across the landscape of the last, let us say, century and a half, one thing we notice is that the franchise has been extended little by little. And after the American and French revolutions in England, there was the Great Reform Bill of 1832. In the what used to be the colonies, there was a development of democratic orders rather more rapidly than in the home country. I mean, for example, you in New Zealand have a great feather in your cap from the point of view of women's right to vote. But the political parties and political interests in all these societies, in recognizing that the franchise was extending and a voice was being given to more and more people, made an effort, and a very successful one, in fact, too successful really, to make sure that their hands were on the levers of power inside the institutions of democracy. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting any kind of conspiracy theory here. I mean, for example, something like this. If you know that there's a certain degree of unpredictability in how the vote is going to go in a general election, then you've got to be pretty sure that if your party does manage to get a majority in the legislature, you have to be able to make sure that you can deliver your agenda. In the case of England and in the United States of America, the party machines, the whipping system, the control over individual representatives in the legislature matters tremendously to the party getting its agenda through. And the result of that is that you don't get MPs in Parliament or congressmen in Congress in Washington representing the country or the interests of the country. You get them representing their party line. And that is one way, a rather insidious and unobvious way, in which the political order gets hijacked. Now, the parallel with social media is, just very briefly, is that we all use it, we all love it, we've all stripped ourselves naked to the view of any public or private agency that wants to know who we're communicating with and what sites we're landing on the internet, etc. But it's not us, it's not we individuals who use social media who are in control of it, but people who know how to use it to message us and nudge us and influence us.
Nudge, indeed, is the name of a unit in the UK government, isn't it? The nudge unit. What are the messages that you can get out on a mass basis that will actually change behaviour in the way that you want? Yeah,
and somebody won the Nobel Prize for saying that nudge now is one of the great techniques of persuasion right across the board, in politics, in advertising, in social policy application. So this is a very significant thing, because I think we've known that political parties will, of course, campaign and argue. They'll make use of propaganda. They'll put spin on their messages. And all this is very familiar, and it will continue to happen. But the use of social media, the fact that you can now use these data got from what they call big data analytics, that you can profile groups of people. You can very, very carefully and precisely hone messages for those groups of people. And then you can do what they call these days hyper-targeting, that is very, very accurate messaging to these different groups. So you can actually weaponize propaganda. You can nudge without people knowing that they're being nudged. And social media has proved to be an extremely powerful weapon for that. Its work in the Brexit referendum and in the United States Trump election was very successful.
Yes, two observations. First, the intervention and, of course, the inquiries ongoing of Russian actors who may or may not have been affiliated in all cases to Russian politics. Some may have just been having a laugh, but we are aware of their attempts to intervene. But also the corporatisation of just what you're talking about, the firms that offer very targeted propaganda messages based on the analytics that they have on people. And I would add to that further, we're seeing the manipulation of algorithms in a way. The idea that you go online and search and you would get some kind of smorgasbord is long gone. What you get is effectively what someone has paid for in order to dominate the first pages that load. All of this, very contemporary challenges to discourse, let alone to voting.
Indeed. And so, the great problem here is about information. I had a friend come over from New York a couple of weeks ago. He told me that he had put onto his Google Calendar the fact that he had an outpatient appointment at a Manhattan hospital. And for the next 3 days, he was bombarded with advertisements for his local crematorium. Now, this shows you just how very, very carefully we're being tracked and monitored by these algorithms who, want to make sure that we get the messages that they want to send us. Now, that one was pretty harmless. But how about this? If you go on Google in order to get some information, supposing, for example, you want to know who the fourth wife of Henry VIII was, the information that you will be given will not just be information as such, of the kind that you might find in an encyclopedia. It will be information given to you on the basis of your profile. In other words, it will be information that Google thinks you would like to have, given that you're the person that you are. That kind of thing is very undermining of the degree of security we can feel about getting the truth, good information, serious stuff out there on the internet, which we're all now so dependent upon.
It reinforces things that you've already liked or already read, and that is the problem. I said again, the idea of a smorgasbord, of getting some kind of a selection of views or of reading or of ideas. The system is being set up to do exactly the reverse, to put you into an ever-decreasing circle, reinforcing what you've already read. There is a temptation to start really thinking conspiracy theory terms here, but it happened that last autumn I was over in Australia, and I had a conversation with a member of the security services there, whose responsibility is cybersecurity. You mentioned Russia a moment ago.
he told me that it's not only Russia. Everybody is doing it. Everybody is messaging. Everybody is trying to get their take on things accepted in other countries they have, trade relationships with or currently dealing with in diplomatic terms for some reason or another. And this is going on all the time. Now, if you think of the amount of time, energy, and expense that goes into this, you can see exactly why it might be in a campaign or in a referendum that a great deal of effort and cleverness will be applied to the fact that in between the two blocks, you'll have the Trump block and you'll have the Clinton block, or you'll have the in block or the out block in a referendum. But in between the two of them, there'll be a group of people who are undecided or who could change their minds or who don't know what to think. They are the ones who are targeted by these techniques, and these techniques are very, very influential, very effective.
I want to leave time to go back in time over democracy, because one of the encouraging things out of your book is that the system we have now is far from the system we've had previously, and maybe we can come up with another system again. And also I want to look at the quality of debate, which is another factor at the moment. There is no debate. And yet in the book we cover things from the debate of Putney through to the founding fathers writing the Constitution. And what characterises both is this rigorous and persistent and deliberate and quite tolerant listening to others' views in order to thrash out a system that works. However, I'm going to just make the call now to get you to carry on and talk about the changes you believe might get things back on track for fear that we'll run out of time. What is it that could address some of our contemporary challenges?
Okay, well, to give a context for that, there are two very, very important rights that democracy exists to deliver. One of them is the right of everybody to have a voice, just in virtue of being a citizen, not because you've got property or money or education or anything else. You're a citizen, so you have a right to a voice in deciding how you're going to be governed and the laws under which you're going to live. But you also have another right, and that is a right to good enough government. I use that phrase because nothing is perfect in our world. So if you ask for perfect government or good government, you're not always going to get it. But good enough government, meaning that your civil liberties, your sense of some social stability, the fact that you live in a society which is predictable enough and safe enough that you can make plans and you can have your career and your family, that's a very, very important right. That means that the institutions of government and the way that the political order works should be transparent, and it should be honest, and it should do what it's meant to deliver. That is a public policy which is in the interests of everybody, including minorities, including people whose views, whose ways of life are different from the majority. So a good order is one where the institutions work well. The point I made earlier is that the institutions have, of course, been hijacked by, party machines, by the fact that one side of the argument wants to get its agenda through, and it will push its agenda through using its knowledge, inside knowledge of how these institutions work, sometimes to the detriment of other groups. So it's terribly important that we should try to get back to a situation where the intention that lies behind having a legislature which is independent of the executive and holds it to account, where people who go as members of parliament should really represent the interests of constituents in the country and not just be slaves to the party machine. It's that kind of thing, very modest reforms that would get us back to what we're meant to be doing in our government order.
Well, let's look at one of the obvious ones. And in the book, we look at the divergence on both sides of the Atlantic into how their democratic systems evolved. Again, each of them out of incredibly thorough, determined intellectual debates. Let's look at what may have gone wrong in the United States, because one thing is apparent is the prolonged paralysis in the Washington system. This is a feature of the way its administrative system was set up. Is it a fatal flaw?
Well, the way it's worked out in practice has made for paralysis far too often, and we've just seen a couple of instances of it with the budget just recently. So there are four great institutions. There's the House of Representatives, the Senate, the presidency, which is as the executive is independent of Congress, and then the Supreme Court. And they're meant to balance one another, this whole idea of checks and balances. But a system of checks and balances only works if there's bipartisanship, if there can be agreement in Congress, and if the executive can have the support of Congress and vice versa over important matters. And in fact, the United States has been a pretty bipartisan country for quite a lot of its history. But in the last, I don't know, a third of a century or more, perhaps since the upheavals of the 60s and 70s, it has become increasingly polarized. And now the political debate in America is deeply toxic. And you see that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, their main interest is in trying to scupper everything that the other party does. And if they have a president from the other party, making it almost impossible for that president to govern. And thus the paralysis that you see. So checks and balances have just turned into a kind of double lock situation. You get the opposite problem in the UK, because in the UK, the executive is drawn from the majority in the legislature, which means that the legislature is not independent of the executive and can question it and hold it to account, but instead it's the creature of the executive. And this is why you get the appalling situation where a very bad decision might be made, like a Brexit decision. You've got a conservative government which has got some very hardline Brexiters in it, and they're forcing the issue. Now, it's not at all clear that this is in the interests of the country, or even indeed in the true majority of people in the country.
What is the solution? Because one thing we will talk about when we get there is that democracy in its earliest iterations was not a universal vote. Going back, I think, to the times of Plato, there was a whole class of people deemed to be experts who weren't allowed families, weren't allowed property, weren't allowed vested interests, and whose mission was to go and to govern in everyone else's interests. Here we are in Brexit being told people are sick of experts. It's all about how you feel and how frustrated you are. So when you look at what gave rise to Brexit and the decision that was made there, what could have resulted in a more informed decision, if indeed that's what ought to have happened?
Well, here's another very, very important point that you're putting your finger on here, which is that in the kind of democracy that we're discussing, which is a representative democracy, where that adjective, representative, is really important. Because what we do is we vote for representatives, not messengers, not delegates, but people to go off to Parliament, get information, get the facts, listen to arguments, discuss, come to a sensible decision and act on that decision in the interests of everybody. That's the ideal. That's what's meant to be happening. But these representatives are charged with the responsibility and paid by us to carry out that responsibility, and they shouldn't be having referendums. Referendums are not natural to representative democracy. And when they happen, it's because the politicians have lost their nerve and they've said, well, let's put this out to a plebiscite and get the voice of the people on it. Well, there are some circumstances in which a yes-no argument is satisfactory for some situation. But something of immense complexity, like the relationship of the UK with the EU, and also of immense constitutional significance, should definitely not be a referendum matter. This is a matter for the representatives themselves to deal with. And the extraordinary thing, the really extraordinary thing about the situation in Britain today is that the great majority of members of Parliament, of the House of Commons and of the House of Lords, are pro-EU. They are pro-Remain. The numbers of people in Parliament who are actually in favour of Brexit are very small. So what's happened? Well, by having a referendum, getting like a bunch of rabbits, frozen in the headlights of the fact that there was a 51.9% majority of votes cast, by the way, that only represents 37% of the total electorate. So constitutionally, of course, this really doesn't carry any weight at all. But the MPs were so frozen in the headlights by that they feel that they've got to try and somehow carry it through. Now look at the situation in America, the same thing. Trump had 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. But they have this electoral college arrangement, and that, of course, has been a disaster because the electoral college the electoral college votes in different areas of the US were targeted by these social media campaigns, and that delivered the White House to Trump. So in both cases, we've got very bad outcomes because the system wasn't worked properly.
Let's look at the question of popularism, though, which might characterise both events. And from within the book, citing others within the book, we get something of a definition of popularism. Not to be confused with demagoguery, seducing voters rather than convincing them. Neither is it being in touch with the people. It's a claim to speak in the people's place and to claim an undeniable shared truth on their behalf. Is that what we have seen either in the Brexit vote or in the United States?
Oh, well, you see, this idea of populism, that there's a kind of upswelling at the grassroots which forms itself into a great political momentum, is actually, in my view, rather a mistake, rather a misunderstanding about what's happening. Because if you think of people who are unemployed or poor or struggling on very low incomes, it's very difficult for such people to organize politically and to start working out a policy basis. What instead happens is that you get people, usually either on the extreme right or on the extreme left, who see an opportunity in the frustrations and resentments of people who are struggling in the economy. Now, the populists that we've seen in Europe recently, people like Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage and Geert Wilders, they go along to people who are disaffected and they say, we know who's to blame. It's the EU to blame, or it's somebody else to blame. And they point the finger, and they're able to organize temporarily support for a movement like, for example, the EU referendum movement, because the people in parts of the economy which were feeling a bit left behind and people were struggling in them were looking for a scapegoat and were looking for a way of delivering a kick to a government which had been applying an austerity measure for too long. And that's how you get populism, quote unquote, which is actually, I think, the result of manipulation by people who see an opportunity to use that distress.
Another way, though, to look at it, I find it interesting when we look at some of the more radical solutions that people are putting forward for amending democracy. And talk about voter ignorance as part of that. But then I'm left thinking, what is ignorance? Is lived experience not as relevant as being some kind of privileged expert on the operations of an economic system? And as part of what we've seen, the idea that knowledge is owned by the experts rather than the lived and often frustrated and disappointed experience of people. What do you make of some of the more radical proposals for reform of democracy that we see in the book?
Well, I'm not really in favour of them particularly. I sometimes make a joke, being a professor of philosophy myself, that I agree with Plato that philosophers ought to be running everything. But then I think of some of my colleagues and I think, well, perhaps not. The point is that the Plato's very lofty and condescending view was that ordinary people, quote unquote, if there is ever such a thing, are too short-termist, too self-interested, not sufficiently well-informed, and therefore they shouldn't have a say in how things are run or done. And that's just a mistake, because as I said right at an earlier part of our discussion here, it's not whether you're educated or knowledgeable or have property or money. It's that you're a citizen. And just that mere fact by itself means that you're entitled to have your say. You're entitled to a voice. But the people who are going to be charged with the responsibility of getting the facts and evaluating them, of taking decisions and trying to make them work, those people should definitely be answerable to those who vote for them. So every 4 years or so, we should be able to recall them or sack them if they're no good or give them another chance. But we should also expect of them that they are competent enough, capable enough of doing a serious job of work. After all, these are people's lives and careers and job opportunities and health and education. I mean, these things need to be thought about done well and thought about carefully. So the people that we send as our representatives to the Parliament should be people who are capable of doing that job. They shouldn't be people who are, in my opinion, again, just a personal thing, sort of career politicians who've gone into it straight away from university. It would be a very good thing if they had some experience in life before they went into politics. But whether or not that were to happen, the really, really significant thing here is that, as they used to say in the Royal Air Force, expertise is tremendously important, but you shouldn't have the experts on top, you should just have them on tap.
Looking back over the systems we cover in the book, I think it was Plato who regarded the tyrannos or the tyrannos with scepticism, called it the worst form of government. I suppose at its most extreme evolution it becomes tyranny. But the other options, experts who are denied a normal life, were they the aristoi? They were denied a normal life in order, almost monk-like, to go off and contemplate hard how the place should be run. Later iterations, we had only people who owned property or had some kind of vested physical interest being able to vote, all the way through to the point where finally we had universal suffrage very late in the piece. When you look back over the history of the evolution of democracy, is there anything we should be going back and revisiting?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it would be terrible to go back to monarchy, for example, or to oligarchy, or to requiring that you're only allowed to vote if you've got a certain level of income or a certain level of education. I think those things would be very, very retrogressive. Instead, we should look forward a little bit, and we should think in terms of popular participation in politics as being a civic duty, and it should be a duty of society to equip people as best as it possibly can to make them good citizens from that point of view. You know, in Belgium and in Australia, various places, the voting is compulsory. And there are other democracies where people say, oh, no, you can't possibly make voting compulsory because that's coercive. Well, my view is that it's as much a civic duty to vote as it is to pay your taxes and drive on the correct side of the road. And that we should inculcate in people from the very early part of secondary education just how important it is, what a great role each one of us has to play when we get to the voting booth. A more thoughtful, a more deliberative, a better informed democracy will be a better democracy and will produce better governments.
It seems, though, if anything, we are slipping back de facto into the idea of the tyrannical leader, or at least the strong man leader, whether we look at those who are proving successful in non-democratic countries or faux democratic countries, or whether we look at what's happening in the United States. And is that an aberration that comes and goes? What?
Well, on the question of President Trump, I think aberration is about the right word in a number of different respects. But you put your finger on something important, which is this, that since 1945, the great majority of countries in the world have either become or have pretended to become democracies. And they have done because they've looked at Western Europe and at the United States, at New Zealand, Australia, and they've seen that countries which are flourishing, which are wealthy, and in the case of the Western European and the North American countries, which are militarily and diplomatically very influential in the world, that they've all been democracies. So these other countries wanted to copy them in order to be able to advance in the same way. But now, of course, there's a completely new model available, and that is the one-party state of the People's Republic of China, vastly successful commercially, and indeed all the more successful for being a one-party state. Because, of course, democracies are usefully inefficient. The inefficiencies of democracy, the result that we have to have discussions and meetings and votes and committees and God knows what else, it slows everything down. It's kind of unpredictable for business because if there's a change of government in a few years, there might be different regulations or tax levels and so on. But in China, with the one party in charge, everything is very stable and predictable. And if you're just interested in making money and you're not bothered about anything else, that's the place to be. Now, if you were the president of a developing country somewhere, let's say in Africa or something, you might look around the world and say, which model should we adopt? Do we want to be able to stay in power all our lives long and have a rich country, in which case we'll follow China? Or do we want to be chucked out in the next election in 2 years' time? Let's, in that case, follow Europe and North America. Well, I think the first model is the one which is probably going to be the most attractive one, and that's bad news. This is why we want to get our democracies back on track and make them work, because we don't want too many countries starting to go down the Chinese road.
On that note, though, in an age of exponential pace of change, particularly technological change, where we see the political institutions struggling to keep up with some of the economic changes, and the regulations we might want as a civil society struggling to keep up. You also have written about democracy being frankly just too slow to deal with the challenges of climate change. Is there a way we can speed the process up?
Well, that is a very good example of how democracy has put itself too far into the hands of the people who pay for political parties to be elected. In the United States of America, money is a huge factor in politics. You can quite literally buy a seat in Congress. If you've got big bucks behind you in an election, you can be pretty sure that you're going to get there. So the influence which big corporations and people who are a little bit concerned about environmental regulations and the like, their influence on the democratic process is too great. One of the reasons why we don't get international agreement and international action at the pace that we need it to save the planet is that there are too many people, too many vested interests wanting to, throw a drag anchor down on this. Look at the United States of America today. After another horrendous shooting in Florida, you get a lot of people talking about, we've got to have mental health and we've got to this, that, and the other, instead of talking about the thing that really matters, which is guns. And that's because of the power of the NRA, the power of gun lobby, and that's across the board with civil rights in developing countries, climate change. All those things are too influenced by how the lobbies that pay for politicians get elected influence those politicians.
Let's end on a positive note, because your other book is a brilliant book too, The Age of Genius, the 17th Century and the Birth of the Modern Mind. I'm hoping that we might be on the cusp of some kind of similar era where a period of what feels like incredible tumult, and in this instance a 30-year war, somehow coincided with, or did it give birth to, some of the most brilliant minds and the most brilliant thinking that were to shape the way forward? Was it coincidence? And can we be hoping for another one anytime soon?
Well, we might be, I mean, if you go back to the 17th century and you think at the beginning of the century, people thought that the stars and the planets were going around us. And by the end of the century, we knew they weren't. And your vision of the night sky when you looked up at the Southern Cross would be completely different between those 2 points, 100 years apart. That great revolution in the way we saw the world and therefore saw ourselves was a mighty one. I mean, it really was the most dramatic shift of perspective that humankind had had to that date. That's why it's such an important century. Well, we, in our own time now, are on the cusp of a major revolution. It's happening already around us, but yet we haven't really appreciated it fully or seen its consequences fully yet. And this is the AI, the artificial intelligence revolution, and robotics. In so many different ways, that's going to transform life and work and human relationships, almost too many ways to mention. And of course, it's happening so fast that we haven't really thought clearly about how to manage it, about which bits of it we want and which bits of it we don't really want. This is a great problem with technologies because, as soon as they become effective, there's a kind of cascade event. There's a sort of tsunami of changes that happen all around us. And they've happened even before we've had time to realize that they're happening. That's a problem.
Good talking to you. We shall live in hope, as always. Thank you, A.C. Grayling. The books we've been referring to, Democracy and Its Crisis and The Age of Genius. He will be speaking at 2 sessions during Writers and Readers at the New Zealand Festival in Wellington in March, and also as a guest of the Auckland Writers Festival in May. It's likely there's links to the information on our webpage.